on section 6.1 entitled Definition of Temperature and Heat. Now, before we go into detail in terms of looking at the definition of temperature and heat, it's important to know what the learning objectives are for this section, and they are as follows. After completing this subunit, you should be able to know what temperature is and also understand the difference between temperature and heat. So let's begin now by looking at a definition of temperature. Now, in order to understand temperature and its definition, we need to really look at the four states of matter. And these four states of matter, these are states that you observe in everyday life, and these are solid, liquids, gases, and also plasma to some extent. So when we talk about a substance, we're really talking about a material which is made up of small particles, and these particles are called atoms and molecules. And any type of substance can exist in one of four distinct forms, which we call states of matter. Now, the four states of matter which are observable in everyday life, these are solids, liquids, gases, and to some extent, plasma. Now, any type of substance can be found in these states, and if we look at the diagram, we can see that the particles in a solid state, they tend to be fixed in terms of their relative positions, but they tend to vibrate backwards and forwards about a fixed point. Whereas the particles in a liquid and in a gas, they tend to be always in motion. And so when a substance is made hotter, the speed of the particles increases and they gain what's called kinetic energy. Now, when we talk about temperature, we're really talking about the hotness or the coldness of an object. And this is due to the average kinetic energy of the particles. In other words, the particles within that substance, as they move around with motion in all directions, they're going to have kinetic energy. So really, when we measure the temperature of a substance, we're actually measuring the average kinetic energy of the particles in that substance. Now, the temperature of a substance does not depend on the size or the type of the substance. So it doesn't matter whether you measure the temperature of water in a big cup or in a small cup. It's basically independent. The measurement of temperature is independent of the size or the type of the material. Now, temperature is intensive. So temperature is intensive in the same way as pressure or density. For example, the temperature of a small cup of boiling water is the same as the temperature of a large pot of boiling water. So we refer to the fact that temperature is independent of the size or the amount of the water that's being measured. We refer to that as the intensive nature of temperature. So temperature is an intensive property, and it doesn't depend on the amount of the substance present. And this is very important that you understand that, especially as we go through the unit on temperature. And so temperature is measured with a thermometer, and temperature is the measure of the hotness or the coldness of matter. And the SI unit of temperature is Kelvin. Now, in terms of a definition of heat, heat is the total energy of molecular motion in a substance. So it's the total amount of energy of all of the motion which is going on inside of a substance. And heat depends on the size and also the type of the material or substance. So we can say that heat is an extensive property because unlike temperature, heat does depend on the nature and the magnitude, the size of the substance. So Because it depends on the amount and the size of the particles in the substance, heat is the form of energy that is transferred between two substances at different temperature. So if you had to give a definition of heat, what you could basically say is that heat, usually given the symbol Q, is the total kinetic energy of all the particles in the substance. It is an extensive property which depends on the size and the type of the substance, and its unit of measurement is the joule, which is given as J. Let's have a look at some checkpoint questions. The first checkpoint question is, explain the term temperature. The second checkpoint question is, describe the difference between temperature and heat. And the third checkpoint question is, how can we relate the temperature of a body with the kinetic energy of its particle? Fourth checkpoint question is, temperature is an intensive property of a body, while heat is an extensive quantity. Explain what this means. So these are your 4 checkpoint questions. So pause the video and open your exercise book and write down your answer to these specific checkpoint questions. And then when you've written down your answers, then press the play button to compare your answers with the answers provided in the solution. Okay, let's have a look at the answer to these checkpoint questions. So, question number 1 was explain the term temperature. There is a measure of the average heat or thermal energy of the particles in a substance. The second checkpoint question was describe the difference between temperature and heat. Well, what you should have written was something along the lines of temperature is an average measurement of kinetic energy of the particles in a substance. And temperature does not depend on the number of the particles in the substance, while heat is the total kinetic energy of the particles in a substance, and heat depends on the type and the size of the substance. Now at checkpoint question 3. How can we relate the temperature of a body with the kinetic energy of its particle? The answer to that would be along the lines of, when the substance is made hotter, the average kinetic energy of the particles in the substance will increase. Therefore, the average kinetic energy of the particles in the substance is in fact directly proportional to the temperature of the substance. And then the fourth checkpoint question was, temperature is an intensive property of a body, while heat is an extensive quantity. Explain what this means. Well, what you should have written for this is something along the lines of, an intensive property is a physical quantity whose value does not depend on the amount of the substance for which it is measured. So, for example, the temperature of a substance in thermal equilibrium with another substance has the same temperature of the other substance. So if you place a substance next to another substance and you leave them for a while and you measure their temperatures, the temperature of both of these substances, which are side by side and touching each other, is going to be the same. While when we think about extensive properties, for example, mass and volume, then in these particular cases, if we look at the heat is going to be dependent on the mass and the volume which is being measured. So this is the difference between temperature and heat. Temperature has intensive property and heat has extensive property. So it's very important that you know the difference between temperature and heat, because a lot of students do tend to confuse the two and mix up their definitions and their meanings. So hopefully you have understood from these checkpoint questions what the difference is between temperature and heat, and now we can move on to the second section within this particular unit, which is section 6.2.